G'day, I'm Mick, and this week we saw the release of Season 2, Episode 1 of Critical Role, which is a huge moment for critters, but doubly so for DMs. There's been a lot of hype to finally see Mercer run a first session in his own world. Many players and DMs alike hold Mercer up on a pedestal as the perfect DM and aspire to achieve or simply imitate his performances for better or worse. And that's why I've made this video. I'm going to break down that first session of Season 2 start to end from a DM's perspective and reverse engineer his preparation. We'll look at what he's doing, why he's doing it, and how you might want to do things a little differently. Obviously, spoiler alert for Season 2 Episode 1 of Critical Role. If you haven't seen it yet, it's up on Geek and Sundry's website, or you can skip ahead to the spoiler-free conclusion at the end of the video, which there's a link to in the pinned comment. So without any further preamble, let's crack into it. Mercer eases us into things with a 500-word introduction to his world, or this story as he puts it. It's gorgeous, starting at the largest scale, establishing the continental regions and time period, and then gradually homing in on the players, all the while trickling in pieces of history. We're all familiar with the usual bland opening. This is the 14th day in Everfall in King Ogrim's 12th year. The banners fly red as duck season, rabbit season draws to a close. But Mercer doesn't fall into the trap of reading off key data points in monotone. He instead paints the character of the region and what defines the people within it. He focuses on their disposition, their struggles, and how recent events have affected their mood. His mere delivery of lines that would otherwise read as facts impart the emotional weight that those facts have on the locals. Every temple is government-owned and run. It's a blow, leaving them downtrodden and defeated. What you should take away from this introduction is not to fully generate and understand the geopolitical history of your starting area and then read it off to the players in the first session. I mean, 500 words might not seem like much. It isn't a lot to write, but it is a lot to listen to. And Mercer only manages to fit it so full of exposition and over a dozen new names because he packs it so full of character. He's not counting on the players to remember all the facts, that the duelist dominion fell to the Empire after Trustenwald. The purpose of an introduction, as Mercer is very much aware, is to set the mood, the atmosphere, and his key to that is character. The introduction comes to an end as we reach the first player. Mercer's preferred style of player-character introduction is for the player to describe their character's appearance, and he sticks to that format throughout the session. Liam and Sam describe their characters who are sharing a private room, and that naturally leads to a brief back and forth between them. When they mention food, Mercer takes this opportunity to interject with a brief sensory description of the downstairs kitchen wafting into their room. This serves two purposes. First, to enhance the setting, the immersion, but also to give them a gentle reminder, a prompt of where they can go next. You'll find Mercer uses this sort of interjection a lot when the players start to slow down or spend too much time focused on one thing. The players heed the prompt and head downstairs, but as Sam's character is a goblin trying to pass as not a goblin by just wearing a porcelain mask, Mercer takes this opportunity to explain just what the disguise is and how it works. This is an important thing to consider because a lot of players get bent out of shape when they feel like another player has something overly cool or unusual that they don't. For all you know, one of your players might have really wanted to play a goblin but never mentioned it because they knew they'd just get attacked on sight. But now this player can play a goblin and just because he wears a mask he's fine? Going out of your way to describe why little advantages are happening, how they're happening, what their limitations are, all will help quell these feelings. I don't think for a second any of Mercer's players are that petty, but it's always good to consider the why behind everything. We then enter the first of two primary locations for the session. The tavern. Here Mercer reads off not just a description, but another introduction to the area. The distinction here being action. It's one thing to describe an inn, what does it look like, what does it sound like, but Mercer again frames those dry bullet points with character. The barmaid is yelling at the bartender, there are people running back and forth. You feel like you're there because Mercer sets the pace. It's frantic, and suddenly the barmaid is in the player's face asking their order, her body language urging them to hurry. Even the music works to amplify the effect. So the players give their orders in a hurry, and before they even get a moment to take in what's going on around them, the food is placed down in front of them. This is the perfect time to cut to the next group of players. After all, we've only got 2 of the 7 in the game thus far. And you could simply cut straight to them. But it's far more interesting for an unknown character to rush towards the players and then at the last second turn towards a new group of unknowns. On the surface, this is a fun little misdirect, but it also works to very clearly establish the relative positions of these two groups of players. Overall, the layout of the tavern is meaningless. Mercer does nothing in here that would require a map, but the relative positions of these two groups of players is vital to their interaction from here on out. So this was a sharp way to inform that. We can also take note of how Mercer describes this new character. He doesn't say height or weight, he doesn't say hair or skin tone. He first says meek. Now that's a descriptor that will immediately conjure a character, not just an image in your head. He pauses, and then adds middle-aged, work-hardened, wild chin-heavy beard, and warm eyes. 5 rapid-fire descriptors, and we've got a clear, unmistakable image of a tradie with a heart of gold. This isn't an improvised character, this is a pre-written NPC described with just 5 carefully chosen terms. But then Mercer does what I think is the most important part of describing any character. He isolates one small detail, one small action of extra import. The character is holding his hat with an eager grip as he looks about the room. The 3 new players, Laura, Marisha, and Travis, then each describe their characters, and Mercer briefly converses with them as the tradie. Turns out he's a fisherman known to them, and has come under the guise of rewarding them for a quest they completed in their session 0. But really, behind the screen, he's here to act as a conversation starter between the 2 groups of players, and then promptly exit stage left. Now how will he do that? Well, Chekhov's hat was full of coin, which he loudly pours over the table in front of the group, while discussing their backstories quite indiscreetly, though that's less important for this purpose. The coin is a perfect mechanic to bring these 2 groups together, because Liam and Sam's duo are quite compulsively light-fingered. Well, Fagin of the Opera is anyway. And so, taking the bait, the 5 players fall into character and spend the next 10 minutes riffing off each other, further exploring the depths of these new characters. At this point, I'll mention the overall time plan of the session. Mercer is very much aware of his time constraints, and he's had a lot of practice with these players. He has an excellent grasp on how long it will take them to perform certain tasks. He knows he has about 3 hours for the show. He wants the players to meet and mingle before heading to the carnival. At the carnival, they get to watch a performance, have a bit of a combat encounter, and then deal with the fallout. So the most reasonable way to go about this would be to divide it down the middle. Give them a nice 90 minutes to feel out their characters as they head towards the carnival. Then the second half can be roughly 30 minutes of carnival preamble and performances, 30 minutes of combat, and 30 minutes of fallout. This means the first 90 minutes can be more flexible and reliant on what the players choose to do. It might be all in the tavern, or they could head to some vendors in town or converse with some locals. All that matters is that at the end of the 90 minutes, they're starting to head towards the carnival. So now, as 5 of the 7 players have been introduced and are getting a good feel for their characters, we're already 45 minutes into the stream, it's time to start thinking about roping in the stragglers. And that would be the next step in Mercer's mind, to introduce Taliesin and Ashley's characters, but he's waiting for the right moment. He's not going to interrupt the players randomly unless it's dramatically appropriate or they start to get a bit off track. And when Liam makes a little mistake that causes everyone to fall out of character for the moment, Mercer responds almost immediately by describing 2 new figures entering the tavern, knowing this will pull everyone back into the game. So the door to the tavern bursts open with the sheer charisma of Ashley's character, and alongside Taliesin they each give their descriptions, and then Talison's character does Mercer's job for him and quite heavy-handedly establishes the main plot for the session. This is not a typical occurrence in most people's home games. It becomes clear that most, if not all, the players already knew that their goal for this session was going to be at the carnival even before they started playing. And really there's no harm in having a player arrive with a quest rather than an NPC, which is something I think DMs are a little afraid of. If the players already know the intended endpoint, the destination for the session before it starts, they mightn't be as interested or engaged. There's no real surprise. But this session proves that the fun, the adventure, is in the journey, not the destination. They were no worse off for knowing Mercer intended them to go to a carnival. They didn't know what was going to happen there. If anything, it helped them keep track of their pacing, as after all, they've been doing this just as long as Mercer and are just as aware of the time constraints. Over the next 20 minutes or so, the characters get to know each other a little bit better, and Mercer is on hand to toss out setting information when it arises in conversation, namely the existence of the Soltress Academy, a clear goal for some of the characters. And he throws out some local family names and relationships of import. But it's the first session, so they're merely touched upon, with just enough to establish their presence as future greater roles that will come into play. The players ask about a bulletin board that Mercer used during their session 0s to hand them out quests, and he improvised an answer here. It wasn't strictly a no, but it was about as close as you can get without saying it. Vole extermination. The little glint in his eyes when Laura considers it is... With only 10 to 20 minutes left in the first half, the players finally head off towards the carnival. This doesn't leave enough time for any sort of real merchant interaction or combat encounter. So with that in mind, and at the request of the players, Mercer bundles it all up into a mini montage, glossing over several breweries he had prepared for the players. He also imparts some new cultural wisdom on the players, as to a distaste for an old name for the party's preferred brew. This of course being a town heavily dependent on its breweries, run by 3 major families as established in the introduction. And from the players' actions and dialogue, it's clear they're already quite familiar with this situation from their character creations and Session 0. So what Mercer is doing here is twisting, updating their understanding of the world. He would have intentionally missed this when preparing the players, so it would be an interesting point of conflict, a relearning moment come that Session 1. There's nothing less interesting than a world that never changes. During the montage, Liam's character briefly interacts with the book dealer that he'd met in his Session 0. There's no description of the journey there, it's instant. You're there, what are you doing? And in the context of a mini montage, that jump doesn't break the flow. While here, Mercer reaches once more into his setting information, restating the general importance of the Clovis Concord and the location of the Cobalt Soul Library, an obvious player goal which, like the Soltris Academy, would have been established between Mercer and the players during their character creations. We're nearing 90 minutes as we finally approach the carnival, and are again treated to a pre-written introduction of the area. But as before, note he doesn't simply describe the wind and the sunset, but renewed energy in the streets, individuals peeking their heads out to look at something. And then we focus on an event. Now these are going to be important characters in this session and future sessions, so we start with a 5 descriptor walkthrough of each of them. And it could even be argued that the fiddler comes with its own leitmotif, a musical cue associated with the character. Darth Vader's March is probably the best example. You hear it and you immediately think Darth Vader. So if Mercer was priming the fiddler to be a recurring character, associating a particular piece of music with him would be a great way to hint at his influence in future events. But it may have just been a meaningless nothing fiddler, only time will tell. That's one of the great things about brief, succinct descriptions and personalized audio. The players aren't immediately flagged as to what will come back and what won't, so they have to stay observant. This introduction keeps a fast pace, much as the tavern did, and it pulls the players with it. The crowd gasps and cheers, the characters are marching forward. It has a great momentum, and as Mercer is building it up, naming some districts that they're marching through, he pauses and asks, "Do you all follow?" Of course they do. He's hooked them. He's not actually asking. He only asks so they feel less like bystanders. When bringing players in a new area, especially a new campaign, it's easy to talk and talk and talk. You have to describe everything for the first time. And even though Mercer is doing a great job of keeping it short, fun, and punchy, he knows to break it up with what are effectively QuickTime events. The players think they're in a cinematic, and then suddenly they have agency and are forced to react with their gut instinct. Yeah, we follow. Mercer brings the procession through several more districts, and they finally reach the carnival. But on the way, note how he describes the Crown's Guard's attire. It's almost an afterthought shoved between 2 actions. Children laugh and chatter excitedly, while the Crown's Guard, in their familiar bronze and vermilion uniform, try to maintain order, torn between themselves, being curious and visibly mistrusting of these hooligans that suddenly have usurped the evening air. He always disguises the exposition with a heavy coat of characterization. It doesn't really matter what the Crown's Guard are wearing in this moment. What matters is how they feel, what they're thinking, and the mood that they're giving off. So when we reach the carnival, how does Mercer describe this tent? It's the second and final primary location for this session. Well, he says new, completely constructed, large, and dark blue. Not quite 5 descriptors, and they're all neutral, or maybe even lacking character, though the players have already crossed its path in their Session 0s, hence the addition of completely constructed. And we don't know how he initially described it to them. But just as with the fisherman, Mercer ties the description off with one final little detail that pulls everything into focus. Lengthy streamers of white and silver flap with the cold winds from the top of the structure. It's no mistake that the description lacked character. That's the point. It's large, it's cold, it's detached from any sort of humanity. That lack of character speaks volumes for what's about to happen. He then reunites the players, allowing them a brief moment to interact with each other before using some colourful characters to accelerate everyone to the exterior tent, where he calls the break. This is a minor detail, but his delivery here is what makes it a cliffhanger. He builds up momentum and declares the break. He doesn't try to oversell it first, he doesn't try to whisper and create intrigue, he just sets the pace and lets them run. Off the cliff, Looney Tunes style. We pick up from the break with action at the entrance to the tent, people being funneled through, clearly setting the player's immediate goal for them. Then our focus is shifted to an NPC interacting with one of the players. They were, for the most part, unimportant. and existed primarily to, well, as always, flesh out the world. We now know there's at least one sick person in the town. But structurally, it existed as a lighthearted moment to break up the tension and the drama that's about to unfold. It exists as a point of difference. The players get the next 15 minutes to themselves, with a brief appearance from the NPC Bo, one of the carnies described in the previous half. He pops up to reassert the player's goal and its conditions of entry. In doing so, establishes much of his personality through his delivery and mannerisms. As the players are still getting to know each other, Mercer asks for a perception check from Travis to notice something obvious that is just yet to be mentioned. The weapon and scabbard on the back of Ashley's character, which seems out of place with the rest of her unkempt form. This wasn't done at a random moment, but after her character shows off a little with Travis's character's weapon. A moment likely to draw more than a cursory glance from those around, especially from the owner of the weapon. This sort of perception check is quite common for this purpose when players first meet, but you don't want to go overboard with them. Just let them arise naturally. A ring might be noticed during a handshake, a weapon when reaching for coin. Revealing Ashley's weapon in this way was a smart choice because it ended up foreshadowing her class reveal, one of the final class reveals for the session. We then enter the tent and a fight is going to take place here, so Mercer's introduction treats the players to the layout, entrances, exits. A note is made of unusual lanterns hanging from the ceilings, indicating a potential use in combat. Attention is drawn to the crowd, who is mashing and cramped around the sides of the tent, telegraphing what will turn into a stampede later on. It then asks the players where they want to stand and gives them further details on the area they choose. The fiddler's leitmotif returns and we're treated to something quite unusual, even for Mercer. A 10-minute pre-written cinematic that leads into combat, which is not at all something you should feel you have to do for a first session. The performance, much like his introductions, is decorated with names and history, but is packed full of character and momentum. But he hasn't really done this for his players though. This is for the tens of thousands in the audience to pull apart and dissect over the coming months. Is it about the calamity, the future of the party, or just an allegory to Vox Machina? You can't say conclusively one way or the other, and that's the point. But again, not something anyone should be considering doing for their first sessions. It would be quite polarizing, to say the least. The way Mercer establishes the combat, however, is something that we should be taking a look at. A man begins to shake, and then the skin on his arms tears, bones splitting out from the flesh. That's not a bad guy, that's a victim. Dust and blood then spit from his wounds as his body swells, and people run away screaming. Okay, scary, but not identifiably a threat. His body may burst and injure the people around him. Mercer then describes some of the other notable NPCs. The girl stops singing and has fright in her eyes. Yeah, but she's young and it's a confronting sight. There's no reason to necessarily think it's a known threat to her. The Devil Toad glances about worriedly. Well, hold on, this worry's the scariest looking thing in here? Maybe he's just a big softie and the screams are startling him. Then the half-orc Bo runs up to take a look at the transforming man. Wait, transforming? Bo shouts for everyone to get out and commands the Devil Toad to get the young singer to safety. Okay, something is most definitely wrong, and those who know what's going on consider it a threat. Mercer now asks the group what they're doing. He hasn't asked them to roll initiative, he hasn't even explicitly stated this is a deadly foe in need of defeating. With each sentence, he slightly escalated the confusing situation, and more importantly, clarified the effect this sequence of events was having on the other NPCs. He then gives the players a moment to react to what's unfolding around them, and I mean just a moment, before he interjects with a final description. The mangled body turning to face the players with a grimace. Roll initiative. That is always a brilliant way to go about combat, because as soon as initiative is rolled, tension lowers, everything slows down, and everyone focuses strictly on combat. But by having a mad scramble to react to a developing situation before initiative, you get to preserve the panic and get real in-character reactions. Like we saw with Marisha believing it's just part of the show, and Laura's character creating an illusory double to protect herself. Then Mercer pulls out a battle map, the only map that we see this session. And while it's full to the brim with set dressing, tents and horses outside, it's a basic map, just a circular interior with an exit on either side. You'd be at no disadvantage representing it to your players on grid paper. You may be thinking, wow, it's full of a lot of minis, but Mercer isn't going to run those as individual NPCs. Instead, he treats the area as difficult terrain, and you could do that on a budget with a coloured piece of paper. There isn't much to say about combat. Players roll for their actions and Mercer describes them. He stands while running combat to physically show the movement of battle. You pull back and uppercut it in the chin, using noises to sell the impact, with punchy descriptions of the aftermath, or lack thereof. He keeps it short and sweet. He has 7 players to get through every round, so momentum momentum is important. When the threat is eliminated, Mercer describes the NPC's response to the violence. The guards rushing in to try and make sense of the scene, while the carnies just seem shocked. And almost immediately, the NPCs turn to the players rather than discussing it amongst themselves and demand to be told what happened. This gives Mercer a chance to rearrange his notes from combat to fallout, and he can gauge what the players understand to have happened and what they misunderstand. It's always possible, even likely, that the players are going to interpret what they've seen completely differently to how you intended. And so by having them immediately describe events, you as the DM can gauge what to treat as assumed knowledge and what you might want to try and correct. The players seem to be focused on the age and well-being of the man who initially transformed, on account of the handout Taliesin provided explicitly stating no elderly or infirm were to attend. It seems too much of a coincidence to them, and whether it's relevant or merely a red herring, Mercer now knows this is their version of events. So once Mercer has things sorted behind the screen, he re-establishes the mood of the NPCs. Children are crying and the guards are visibly nervous, clearly out of their depths, so they call for backup. Mercer doesn't bring attention to an exit or anything new, he just lets the players do as they will. They could choose to leave, although the guard wants them to stay, or they could hang around and investigate the area. They've been made aware that backup is coming, what they do with that information is on them. When a couple of minutes have passed in game, the reinforcements arrive, led by the Watchmaster, a jaundiced man with a commanding voice who confronts the leader of the carnival. This was the most likely outcome after the battle, so Mercer had this exchange pre-written. It's brief and soon opens up to the players to weigh in. The possible outcomes from this interaction are to get arrested, run and be hunted, or to play along honestly as a witness and be told not to leave town until the investigation is over. For the most part, they behave, so things go well, with the exception of Ashley, who runs to LA, and Taliesin, who makes a poorly timed joke and then fails to save it with a nat 1. Mercer closes the conversation and the session with a threat. If information isn't found to clear the players of any involvement, they'll be treated as if guilty. The final words being, "If you flee, I'll find you." This flat out states the first small arc for the players over the next couple of sessions. And they now have several NPCs, several leads that they can follow. And they have a week to think on it and prepare their next move. And that's it, that's Mercer's session 1. So looking back over it, what's there? What did he need to prepare, and what would you need to prepare for something similar? We have a town. We know its name, we know who rules it, and we know who enforces the law. We know their primary exports, and we know the powerful families that have arisen as a result. But only one part of that was intrinsically relevant to the first session: the Crown's Guard and their no-nonsense approach to discord. What about the greater setting, the world at large? We know Mercer has a whole room at home dedicated to Exandria. But for this session, the only things he needed were names of future locations, future goals that the players had already established with him. The Sultress Academy, the Cobalt Soul, and the Badlands of Jorhust. We were also told how some of them sit respective to each other geographically. But none of that matters to the players in the first session beyond the name. Mercer doesn't need a map for the Sultress Academy ready. He doesn't need to know the names of its leaders. If asked, he can improvise. They're not going to meet them anytime soon, so he has weeks to prepare and flesh them out. What he did need was to bring the players together, a meeting of fates, and his choice was a tavern. Now, there was no map, no menu that everyone overthinks, and no paragraph describing the texture of the walls. But there was a name and 2 NPCs that worked there, who Mercer would have given some personality quirks were they to be engaged by the players. Another prepared NPC entered the tavern to bring the 2 groups of players together, and the final group required no such introduction. When the players head towards the carnival, his second location, on the way he mentions some breweries, their owners, and perhaps a bombok confrontation he might have prepared. But we see none of this in the first session. What we do see is a bookstore. Again, minimal description, he establishes the layout when asked, and is staffed by a single quirky NPC with a memorable voice, instead of a page-long backstory that only Mercer will ever know. Really, this entire location and character could have been improvised. It wasn't, but it could have been. Once we arrive at the carnival, we meet some important NPCs, each described with the 5 descriptor rule. These are big players for the short term, so he almost certainly has fleshed out some hidden motives and secrets for each of them. Inside the tent is the one and only battle map that we see, and it's complete with one creature. Granted, it can make weaker versions of itself. And over the entire session, Mercer has pre-written a handful of colourful introductions. An intro for the game, an intro to the tavern, the carnival parade, the main carnival performance, and finally the confrontation between the guards and the carnies after the zombie apocalypse. Each of these stuck to character, movement, and action, and were 500 words or less, with the exception of the carnival performance, which was something special for you. So does that mean to run a first session like Mercer, you need one map, one creature, 2 locations, a half dozen NPCs, or at least their names that he could adapt to fit whatever role he needed, and 2 pages of creative writing? Well, no, not quite. That's ignoring half, more than half of what made it amazing. The players, their performances, their comfort with the game and familiarity in Mercer's setting. Mercer has a huge advantage because he knows these players work well together. He knows they're going to enjoy the style of game that he's about to run, and even knows how much to prepare for each of them. And while that is the preparation necessary for this session, there's a lot more going on than that. Firstly, the players had mini sessions with him in groups during their session 0. For 5 of them, it was based around the tavern and completing quests off the bulletin board, while the other 2 arrived with the carnival and encounter the guards. So for those introductory sessions, Mercer already had the tavern fleshed out. He already had several basic quests ready to go with the relevant NPCs. He had shops prepared, or at least interesting shopkeeper NPCs that he could adapt to fit the required trade. We know Ashley bought a sword. And each of these groups got in a small combat encounter. This means that the tavern and the bookstore weren't prepared for session 1, they were prepared earlier. And secondly, the players are invested in Mercer's world for the long haul. They care, and they want to make interesting, fleshed out backstories. They need a past and they need goals for the future. It's impossible to say how much of the world building informed or was informed by the character creation process. We won't come to know all the secrets of these characters for years, if at all. Liam's issue with the Soldiers Academy and whoever Laura is talking to in the air, there's a lot going on with these characters that is intrinsically tied to the world that Mercer has created. So what do you need to run a session like Mercer? You need to get to know your players and learn their passions. Mercer's only able to run a game like this because they're a bunch of nerdy-ass voice actors who love to dial it up to 11 to entertain you guys. Your table isn't going to be Mercer's table. If your players like to dungeon crawl and never roleplay, that's fine. If your players don't care for combat and want to focus entirely on the story, that's great too. Don't try to imitate what you perceive to be perfect. Experiment, discover what you like, discover what your players like, and then take some lessons from atop the pedestal. Limit yourself to 5 descriptors that tell a story. Introduce a setting through action and the people within it. Describe combat physically to heighten engagement. Plan confrontations to have multiple endings that can open different paths. And don't be afraid to stay silent and let the players take the lead. Almost half of that session was just players talking to each other. And that concludes my breakdown of what I consider to be the most important episode of Critical Role we've yet to see. Are you going to take anything away from that, or do you just want to share a theory on what on earth that play meant? If you like this, you like what I'm trying to build on this channel, consider sharing this with some other DMs or just simply subscribing. I do a new video every week. In the meantime, you can check out my video on avoiding over-preparation, which is sort of related to this, or my own first encounter. But that's all for now. Thanks for stopping by, and until next time, I'll see you guys down under in the comments.